I'm going to talk about porch schematics for the first part, porch configurations, porch parts, that type of thing. I'm going to get into then how some do's and don'ts relative to the restoration of individual components, and then lastly some overall do's and don'ts on porches. And I'll apologize in advance. I hope I've got some Mount Vernon examples. I'm trying to bring in other cities' examples as the bad examples and only use Mount Vernon as the goods, but there's just a couple of them I couldn't pass up. So they are here. So I apologize in advance if I offend anyone. Your house value will not go down just because I mentioned it here. All right. And keep in mind these designations are general in nature. They don't really, there's so many porch configurations that actually mix and match different styles, but this gives you one general way of classification of porches, and then I'm also using this as a way to introduce Mount Vernon porches. But the first and most common one is probably what we call the full width porch. Right away it's a misnomer because it really isn't full width. It usually is about 3/4 of a width. You want to make sure a full width porch typically is held back a couple of feet from the end of the house so that when the overhang of the roof extends out, it doesn't have to wrap around the edge of the house. Full width porches like this can either have a hip roof or they can have a gable roof. The hip roof, either way, the roof slope is usually much shallower than the pitch on the main part of the house. Most Victorian houses in Mount Vernon will be 10-12 or 12-12 or even a 14-12 pitch. Roofs on porches typically are in the 3 to 4-12 pitch. And not to give it drainage, but not to dominate the form of the house. A couple of examples in Mount Vernon. I don't remember where all these houses are at. Last week I went around and shot most of these pictures, so I didn't write down where they're at. One of these days we'll do that. But anyway, this is a classic full width, what we call a full width porch. It's got all the basic components. It's got a nice balustrade. And I'll start pointing out, again, balustrades can be turned or they can be straight. But when you're putting on a new balustrade, and I'll mention this later, pay very particular attention to scale. I see too many, in my opinion, stair parts being used to actually form balusters. And typically stair parts are too tall and narrow to be the proper proportion for use in a balustrade. And you'll see a couple of examples of that here. I apologize in advance. Here's another full-width porch, and I wanted to point out something unique about this particular porch. Does anybody know anything unusual about this one? Going back to the previous one, there is a beam which is present pretty much in every porch that you see, but here's one where there is no beam up there. It's kind of interesting. I'd like to look at a historic photo of this particular house and see if it was always that way. I've only seen one or two like that in all the times I've looked at porches. Obviously there's a structure there, but the structure is recessed up into the roof itself. Anyway, just thought I'd point that out. The second type of porch we're going to talk about is what I call, it's a full width porch, but what it has is an accentuating gable at the front of the porch. Again, Dick mentioned earlier that the porch is there to bring attention to the entrance. In this case, you even bring attention to the entrance of the porch, which is usually offset directly from the entrance. So here you have a gable end. We have several of this type in Mount Vernon. There's one right there. Basically it's a full width porch, but it has an accentuating gable where you would enter the porch and thus enter the house. Another one, same kind of thing. Here you see the hip roof. I think you have that on most of our porches. It's a hip roof. Most of you, I think, know the difference. A gable roof would actually, at the end of the roof, you would see a sort of a triangular piece here. That would be a gable end, whereas the hip roof, you never see an end of the roof. Here's the gable end. You might see it at the end if it was a gable-ended roof. The next type is actually an extension of the accentuated entry, where you actually take that gable entry or that accentuating point and project it out in front of the porch. Again, these are just subtle differences, but when you know that all these kinds of things exist, you start noticing them on houses. And again, we have a couple, three of those in Mount Vernon at least. This is Stein's porch. Here you've got the basic porch, but they've accentuated the entry area. And here's the President's house on Cornell campus. Again, it's a basic porch, but here they've extended it out at the point where you enter it. So that's just another variation of a typical full-width porch. Now we get into the ones that are more popular. These are the true social porches, and that's the ones that are actually wrap around the house. And here in plan, you can see it wraps around one side or two sides. And here's a typical one wrapping around two sides of the house. Another one, look interchangeable except for the roof on the house. But here is a lot of times the wraparound porch went from the main door and actually went around and entered into a side door. That's fairly typical to connect the front of the house to the side. That way, socially, somebody could come up and actually, if they were guests, they'd be into this house, but if they're more friendly with the family or if they're family members themselves, they probably walk right on around and go into the back side of the house, which is probably the kitchen or parlor. A variation on that is the curved wraparound. Now this is actually a Solon house, but here you have one that's a curved wraparound. Same type of concept. It goes around two sides of the house, but and enters into a door on the side, but it does wrap around the house. And here's Guy Booth's house. This is sort of the ultimate in wraparound in the fact that it wraps around three sides of the house. And there's multiple doors, I believe, you enter in here, is there not, Guy? Each side? Yeah. Yeah, there's no door in the front here. The doors are on the side. But this is in the Ash Park District. This is a curved wraparound that wraps forever. The next type I call the L shape. It's really, the L shape is really more the shape of the house. It's set into the crux formed by two projecting wings of the house. And again, this is an Iowa City porch, but here you have, in essence, an L-shaped house with a porch infill. On structures like this, you might find 3 or 4 porches on a single house. Every time there's a break in an angle of the house, you might find a porch in the crux of that angle, because a lot of times there was doors or entrances in those locations. This isn't really exactly fit that area. This is the old Harrison house, but again, it has a porch insetting there. This was probably added later. It probably had a porch here and a porch here. Another one is the inset porch, and this is getting harder to define them, but typically an inset porch, I define it as one that is recessed within the main roof form of the house. It doesn't project out from the house, it's actually recessed into the house, as is shown by here is the porch in this sort of diagrammatic explanation of it. In reality, here's the main roof form to the house, and then the porch is inset on the second story. Another one, here's actually the house itself. I mean, a livable portion of the house is there, and it's on the corner, but again, it's an inset type of porch. Another inset type of porch. Here's the main portion of the house. Nothing projects out beyond the actual walls of the house. This is actually inset into the porch, into the house itself. And with a bungalow-style house, that's a fairly typical thing to have the broad sweeping roof form, and then the sweeping roof form actually enclose the roof of the porch. And so this is a bungalow-style house, and that's fairly typical in that style of house. We have several two-story porches in Mount Vernon. Two examples here, the Randall House, which has been, this porch was recently restored, I believe, a few years ago. And then one of the Cornell, no, this isn't Cornell, this is, yeah, Speck, one of the Speck houses that survived. But here we got a two-story porch. And the porches may not exactly mimic from top floor to bottom floor. And the second floor porch may be smaller, it may be bigger, it may be oversetting another porch. Again, just some things for you to take notice as you go on your walks around Mount Vernon. And then we have what I call purely the entry porch. It's designed to do nothing other than provide a little bit of protection for somebody standing at the front door, or maybe not even protection. It's just simply a matter of saying, here is the front door. And this one here certainly doesn't do much more than that, but it does identify this as being the door. This one in an Iowa City house does provide a little bit of protection, but certainly it's not a social porch, as Dick was referring to earlier. Another one like that, again, it provides some protection, some ornament, and a definition of where the entry is, but definitely not a social porch. Here's one that doesn't even provide any type of protection. This is the bracket house, and this is simply a definition of here is the entrance to the house, as well as some ornamentation. And a couple more. Lyons House and Collins House on the campus. So you have the whole gamut of porches, from the wraparound on multiple sides of the house, which serves a social function, to the other end of the spectrum. They're just as important for the houses that they're on, but they serve a totally different function. So that's sort of the overview. These are the way we classify porches. Now we'll get into the actual components of the porch itself. This is in one of these books here. I just copied it, scanned it in, but just so to help you identify what we're talking about when I talk about a spandrel or a column or a bracket, the fascia on a porch or on a house is the area at the very end of the roof, forms sort of the transition between the edge of the roof and the soffit. That's the fascia board up here. And in many cases, that fascia board may actually be a cove molding or something a little fancier than just a straight board. The next area is the soffit. That's the under area underneath the overhang. We have typically a beam. I pointed that out at that one house that actually didn't have a beam, but that's the part that really is the structural part supporting the roof. This part is called the spandrel. It really is not a structural portion of the porch. It's an ornamental detail. Then we have brackets, porch posts. I've never heard of this one before, Cupid's key, but I don't know if we have any of those in Mount Vernon. Anyway, that's just some of the semantics, and that's actually in one of those handouts also. I copied this one sheet just so you'd have that. So I'm going to talk about each one of these elements and some things that you should and shouldn't do when you're doing these kind of things. A foundation, of course, is important for any type of a structure, and the porch is no exception. Things about Iowa: ideally your foundation should extend below the frost line, which in this part of the state is around 42 inches. It's possible on a porch to do it without an extension below the frost line, but what is critical if you're going to do that is to make sure that you have well-drained soil, because frost causes its action by moisture being in the soil. Moisture, when it freezes, expands, and that's what causes things to heave and then later come down. So if you have an extremely well-drained soil, you might be able to get by without going below frost level, but to be on the safe side, I would recommend that anything you do for foundation extend below our frost line. Most foundations should be made ideally of concrete, but secondarily you could sink a post of treated lumber if the soil is of adequate character and if the loading on that particular element is not very high. It's probably a more appropriate thing for the outrigger on a stair than it is for an actual foundation on a porch. I would recommend that you sink a pier down 42 inches, form the top of it wherever you're going to be, and that should be sufficient to carry most porch loads in that I've seen. Extend the top of it 6 to 8 inches above ground. The reason is quite simple. That's going to carry a wood element of some kind. That's the foundation, and you want to separate that wood element from the ground by 6 or 8 inches just to simply prevent rot. Termites is another issue. They're not too bad in Mount Vernon, but normally in any building code they'll recommend that the soil be at least 6 inches below the top of any foundation. The same thing should apply in a porch. And I like to see, if you're doing concrete, form the top of the piers. You see sometimes where they dig a post hole and they just dump the concrete in, and then when you see that, it looks like it's sort of meandering all over the place. It doesn't take much just to, even a 2x4, well, 2x6 I guess, since I said you should be 6 inches above ground. Just make a little box out of a 2x6, set it on top of that augured hole, so that when you see the top of that pier, it looks like it's been formed. No reason to form it the entire way down, but certainly the top of it would make a nice, clean appearance. A couple of different foundation types. Neither one of these are the one I'm just talking about. I'm talking about the sunk pier. This is actually only valid here for good soil where it doesn't go down late. You are seeing a few porches, and I'll show a couple of examples of those, that actually, instead of having a wood deck, actually have a concrete deck. It's not necessarily recommended, but it can be done if the porch doesn't have a lot of vertical rise above the surrounding grade. Here's an example. This one looks like it's been formed. It's a concrete pier that went down. The top of it was formed, and this is, ideally you probably want to have that up a little higher, but there are exceptions. When it's down this low, then it becomes very important not to make sure it gets overgrown with vegetation, and you do need to monitor it periodically because, again, it's a way for termites, if you have them in the area, to go from the soil into the wood structure. So you need to monitor that if you're going to have it that close. Here's an example where the porch, the floor level of the house, and thus the porch, we're pretty much on only 8 inches to a foot above grade. In this case, a concrete floor system and foundation was really an adequate solution. And actually, to try to do this in wood would probably not work because you're so close to the ground. You'd be constantly battling rot and things of that nature. Floors. A couple things about floors. Number one, it should always slope away from the house. I wish I'd taken a picture of this house in Cedar Rapids. I used to drive by. That somebody, in their wisdom, thought that this sloping porch meant that it must have sagged. So they jacked this thing up so it was level. It was the weirdest looking thing I've ever seen because you just naturally expect to see that. But the porch is no longer there, obviously. When you jack it up like that, no longer can the water drain, and so whatever problem they were having, that's just simply accelerated or augmented the problem. But porches are designed, should be designed to slope approximately 2 inches from the house to the edge of the porch. A porch is open. Water gets on the porch. You want to make sure that water can get off the porch. Most porches are done using narrow boards. I've got an example which you might look at. This is one of the newer products on the market. It's called Tendura. I'm not even sure if it's available around here. But it's a composite product. It's wood impregnated with some plastic materials, but it's made primarily for porch deck construction. Has better stability to the wood, less problem with rotting. And this is just one of several products that are out there on the market today that you probably should take a look at if the deck in your porch is going wrong. I have personal experience with that. Used to have a house out in the country, and I thought I was doing everything right. I bought treated lumber to start with. I painted the lumber all sides. I put it in the porch, and it lasted like 4 years. It didn't rot, but it was just undulating back and forth. So I would look very favorably towards some of the synthetic materials if you can find them. The board joints should run parallel to the slope. It probably makes sense, but it's worth bearing. If you run perpendicular to the slope, that means as the water exits the porch, every 3 or 4 inches, it has a joint to contend with. And there's no way you're going to be able to keep those joints tight. So that means every 3 to 4 inches, if you don't run the joints parallel, that means you got a place for water to collect and cause a problem. If the joints run parallel to the slope, at least you have a channel for the water to actually exit the porch. Fairly simple, straightforward thing. What that does mean is you have to plan the substructure, what supports that floor. You have to plan that accordingly so you can run those boards that way. And overhang the boards at the porch edge. I mean, just like on a roof, you have an eave which forms a drip. On a porch, you want the boards to overhang 1.5 inches or 2 inches, give or take a little bit, just so that the water as it comes off will drip down ideally to the ground as opposed to coming back on the structure and the skirt and everything else that's below there. And I like to have you treat the end grain of that wood with something, either multiple coats of paint or preservative, because that end grain of that overhang is just like a sponge. I mean, when water comes down, it has to go across that end grain, and it'll just suck that stuff right up. So you want to give multiple coats. Make sure you have that sealed as tight as you can possibly make it. This is Abby's porch. But here's the porch slopes from here to here. The boards are parallel to the slope. That's the way it should be. I couldn't tell from here whether it's overhanging or not, but even this has had probably a little bit of problem there with water absorption. When water starts to absorb, the boards will curl or rot. Lots of different problems.
I don't think you have the overhang. You just cut it on the middle.
There is, but it's very small.
Yeah. So and the cold molding trap the moisture.
Yeah.
If you're going to have a small one.
Yeah, there's a molding underneath here, and actually, if you have an 1.5 inch overhang, but then you put a cold molding underneath that's 1.25 inches, it's going to catch the water. You're better off, if you're going to have a cold molding, then you need to extend it out even further. Because you've all seen how water works. It goes down and it almost tries to climb back up a little bit before it drops. So you got to give yourself probably a good inch before you have anything that might, well, won't get into that. Next thing we talk about is skirts. Skirt is the area that runs between the floor and the foundation. Typically, the skirts are made up of boards that are either sawn, they could be slatted. I've got several examples of those. Those skirts are there for a purpose, and they're slatted for a purpose, and that's so that air can move in and underneath the porch. So it means cats and all the other animals can be there too. It's amazing what you can find underneath an old porch. But it is critical that you get air movement underneath that porch, because even if water does not leak through the porch, water will come up through the ground into that area, and if there's no air movement there, you're going to get some rot. Even the best of preservative type of woods can't endure being constantly wet. They can take constant wetting and drying for almost ever, but if you put any wood in a constantly wet environment, there's very few of them that will survive. Typically, you see the column lines that come down expressed through to the foundation, as opposed to having a column come down and then somewhere else is the foundation. I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. And again, try to hold the bottom of that 4 inches to 8 inches above the grade, just so that you don't have problems with moisture. The closer it is to the grade, the more water is going to splatter on it when it rains, the more problem you're going to have with vegetation. And Dick mentioned this earlier, keep your planting away from that skirt. Actually, keep it away from the house in general. It's fine to have foundation plantings, but you know, what happens in most cases is people see this great, nice little 2-foot diameter plant, and so they put it 3 feet away from the house. Well, that plant grows, and as it grows, it then begins to rub against and touch. So you have 2 issues. You have just the constant rubbing from wind driving the leaves, and the other one is, of course, it traps moisture, which is always a disaster for porches. So be careful in your selection and use of plantings. Foundation plantings are great, but make sure they don't hinder the drying out of the porch. Just a few of the examples around Mount Vernon. Again, here is a sawn wood ornament skirt. In theory, this is going a little too close to the ground. You can probably get away with that if you do some type of a mulch that does not hold moisture. You know, a wood mulch would probably not be good. Some type of a rock mulch would probably be better. Here's one where it looks like there has been some growth right up next to it, and you can see where it's caused the paint to peel off at the very least. Right after the paint goes, the next thing that happens is going to start to rot. But there's some great looking skirts. A lot of work goes into those. You notice I didn't show any of them that have the slatted ones. That can be used, but it's and this is on the Dillard porch. Here you got almost this here is sort of reflected in the balustrade. Next part we'll talk about is columns and piers, and posts, whatever you want to call them. It's all the same thing. You'll find them in Mount Vernon typically in singular columns, but they may be grouped in 2s or 3s in some cases. You may or may not have half columns at walls. I'll show you some examples of those. It's just part of the expression. We've got every imaginable kind in Mount Vernon. We've got square, and by square I don't mean 4x4s. These are squares that are proportioned for the porch. You have many turn columns, we have fluted columns, we have tapered columns, a little bit of everything in Mount Vernon. We have some that go half height and some that go full height. Sometimes the foundation of the porch is actually extended up to the top of the rail, and then the porch only forms the area from the rail on up. And typically they're all formed some type of an ornament. They are the beginning of the upper part of the ornamentation for the porch. A couple of them in Mount Vernon. I think this is on the visitor center. Does anybody know their Greek orders? That's an Ionic column. The scrolls is Ionic. You get Ionic, Doric, and Corinthian. You don't see too many Corinthians, but you see a lot of Doric and Ionic. This isn't any particular order, but it's a very nicely detailed top of a porch post somewhere here in Mount Vernon. I can't remember where I saw it at.
How bad was it carved into the roof, or was it inside? How was that done?
My guess is that it was probably a separate piece that was attached to it. I don't know that for a fact. But you look at the rest of the porch, it's recessed back there. This is typically would have been an applied ornament. If you look through the pattern catalogs, even the stuff we have here today, you can buy lots of fretwork and lattice work, and my guess is that that was probably applied after the fact, not carved into the column. It's just an educated guess, though. Here's a fluted column, a fluted half-high column, that's what I call it. Here's the foundation piece coming up here, and then we have the column there. Here is a square column. Typically when you see square columns, they're not 4x4s. They are proportioned for the porch. Basically a 4x4 is not a good porch post for most of the Victorian homes. Even the basic core dimension of the porch, the turn posts are usually 5 to 6 inches. They'll get down to maybe 3.5 or 4 inches in the narrowest part of the turns, but a 4x4 typically is not a very good proportion for the Victorian home. Now this is on the high side, but this is a post-Victorian home. This is dates from the 20s, I believe. Now here's one of the examples where we have multiple columns. Here's 3 columns. Now this isn't a half column, but here they actually did put a column back against the wall. Here's another version of the Ionic column in another house. Now this is in Iowa City. Now this is sort of the ultimate Ionic column with a lot of other ornament, along with some dental molding up near the top. Somebody asked a question earlier about the molding at the fascia, and this type of molding here. I didn't bring that catalog here, but there's a company that makes synthetic, it's actually a structural foam molding, and to be honest with you, that's what I would recommend using if you are in a situation where you need to restore some molding like this, or that fascia molding. An example of what that looks like, at least the egg and dart, or excuse me, the dental molding, if you go out on the Hills Bank out here on Highway 1 and 30 intersection, the dental molding up there is just, it's called Fipon. It's just one of the manufacturers. It's a synthetic product, but it holds paint extremely well. It can be sawn. It's a great product to use in that kind of an application. Nothing against the wood people, but here's an example of the half-high column. Here's the foundation basically extending all the way up past the balustrade, and then you have the column itself going above that. Half columns. Here we have a round column. The round column is cut in half. In this day and age, you can buy half columns. You don't have to take a column and have somebody cut it in half. You can actually buy half columns designed to fit that area. Here is your basically turned porch post. Same thing. You can buy them as a half column. You also might be able to find some in salvages. There's a place down between here and Iowa City, just north of Solon. They used to specialize, or at least have a lot of, it's an antique store, and they used to have a lot of old house parts. Here's that one you saw earlier, and here's a half column against the wall. And actually they went one step further and put a flat area for that half column to rest against. Rails and balusters, they're almost always present. Dick pointed out one example where there wasn't one, and you see a couple in town where it may have been debatable whether there was a rail or not. But for the most part, you always have rails or balustrades. They can be turned, square, or solid. They're usually thicker and shorter than typical stair parts. That's why we generally don't recommend using stair pieces in your porch. They just don't have the same proportions. They typically have both top and bottom rails. They don't build them this way. You don't build them this way anymore, do you, Jim?
Actually, the one on the right we did, a porch on the south side of town was 45. We did a 45 rail because we set the bottom support on edge. Mm-hmm. You know, what you have underneath that top piece, and then we went at 45 and then 45 all the spindles. Yeah. It's great for runoff and drainage. Oh, yeah. You'll never have a problem.
Yeah, that's the whole theory behind this concept, is getting the water off of the pieces, because otherwise, if you just have a flat piece, I don't care what you do, if you got a flat to anything on the top, that's going to hold water. So here you've got
labor intensive, pretty labor intensive.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's not cheap to do it that way, unless you can buy the parts already made. Of course, you pay more for the parts. And
I haven't seen them, but it is really, from a technical aspect, it really sheds the water great.
Yeah. But here you see a handrail. It's got a cap rail that goes over a sub rail, so the attachments for the sub rail are not even visible, or they're all protected from the elements. The handrail itself is then attached by screwing from the underneath. And here you see a similar scenario. The parts that hold it, all of the fastening devices are actually hidden from the moisture and from view. So that's the old way. I don't have a... here's an old, here's the whole assembly. This is Margheim's porch down in the corner of the Ash Park district. But it's a great example of they came to us, and I think originally they were going to tear the whole thing off, and we went down and met with them on a rainy day and said, well, you could save this. You've got some really great product. It wasn't rotten, it just was sort of falling apart. I think they ended up replacing the porch post, but everything else was salvaged and restored. Here's another one. This is just square, 1 by 2 by 2 members. But again, you look at the height versus the width and the scale. There's a big difference between this and using, if you were to take that same element, stretch it out to 40 inches high, it wouldn't look nearly as good. This is Abby's porch again, and then this is one in Iowa City. There's nothing that says that they had to be all, turned balusters. Some porches actually have an ornamental piece embedded within the balustrade itself. As we move higher on the porch, the ornament gets more intricate, and of course the spandrels in the areas at the top, you have that's where you have a lot of those turn spindles that go all the way around the porch. Egg and dart ornament, festoons, and garlands. We won't get into that. A lot of them are spindled, and then that's where you see most of the brackets on a porch. So ornament is very important in porches. Actually, this is what you call a seasonal porch, because if you go by there now, there's a different set of ornaments there. It's sort of like the yard ornament type of thing, except it's on the porch.
I think that place looks like New Orleans.
It has a ring of... Yeah, it's a patriotic theme when I went by this time. This must have been after the war started. But I just couldn't pass up taking a picture of that one. But ornament is important. This is sort of what you see on a lot of porches. Here's the spindled spandrel. That says spindled spandrel. And then here's brackets. Typically, in the mid-span, you have a bracket coming out here at the soffit line, and then a lot of times you had additional brackets supporting the spandrel. They really don't serve any purpose other than ornament. That porch will not fall down if you take any of those elements off there. But they add a tremendous amount of visual interest to the porch. Here's getting a step fancier with a carved bracket with a pendant from it. And the Christmas lights, of course, those are newer. But you have a very intricate turned spindle up there for the fascia piece. Moving on, there's not much to say about the ceiling other than the fact that the typical material used is not T111 plywood. It's a beaded ceiling board. You see it used for both wainscoting and ceilings, not only in porches but also in commercial structures. Typically the roofs are low slope. I pointed that out earlier. Usually 3 to 412 slope pitch, sometimes as low as 2, but you start getting down that low, you've got to take a close look at your roofing materials, because most shingles won't work when you get down to a 212 pitch. You might even want to go to an elastomeric type of roof or a metal type of roof. Some gables, but mostly hip roofs. And a lot of times you have a narrow overhang than you have in the main portion of the house. It's all a matter of proportion. The house is big, so it demands a bigger overhang. The porch is smaller, so the overhang is scaled down accordingly. If you have a 2-foot overhang on the main part of the house, you're probably only going to have a 12 to 16-inch overhang on any porch. So again, it's all a matter of proportion, and proportion is something that's hard to communicate to people. It's just something you see it and you either know it's right or something's wrong with it. It's sort of acquired. But here's a typical beaded ceiling. Now we'll talk about porch reconstruction. Can anybody see anything wrong with this photograph? Well, actually, I think this is one of those ones Dick was talking about where they added the porch. They started out with a bus, and then they added the porch later. Anyway, you got to throw some levity in here periodically. One thing about porches, and this is a general saying with all preservation: restore, keep what's there if at all possible. Just because it's starting to deteriorate or a small piece of it is deteriorated, don't assume that you got to rip out the whole thing. A lot of times it's less expensive, and certainly it's going to have a greater impact on the historical value of the house if you can use the materials that are there and simply augment them, repair them, and augment the ones that are no longer repairable with, with new products. So typically, always repair and only replace when you really have to do it. If it is too far to be gone, chances are there still are a few pieces of that porch that might be able to be used for patterns to make duplicate pieces. So save the pieces, even if you aren't going to do it. Save them, put them in a box, stick them up in the attic so that if you can't afford to do it or don't want to restore the porch, maybe somebody after you has the elements that they can use to do it. Use a design appropriate to your neighborhood. Again, this is a basic tenement of preservation. You've got this nice Victorian house and you saw this porch somewhere in New England that you just died for, and you decide you're going to put that on your porch. Don't do that unless that was a porch that would have been found in homes in your neighborhood and of the proper era. Nothing looks worse than to take a one style of home and put a different style of porch on it. We talked about scale. Use materials that are going to endure. The porch is going to undergo more hardship than probably any other aspect of your house. It's always, because of the fact that it's outside, it's always exposed to moisture. So use materials that are able to withstand that moisture. So in the wood area, if it's exposed, cedar, redwood, to a certain degree you can use treated woods, but then take a look at some of the new synthetic products that are becoming available. Paint or stain, expose treated lumber. Treated lumber, don't leave treated lumber there. It just doesn't look right. You can drive around and see that everywhere. Enclose with care. I've got a couple examples coming up to show you if you want to enclose that porch, and there are reasons to enclose porches, and it can be done successfully, but just you have to exercise care when doing it. And take a look at the synthetic products. I am not a proponent of vinyl. I've become, vinyl is final. Sort of the final solution, but the fences and all that kind of, it just, I don't know. When I first saw it, I thought it might be a good product, but the shininess and the scale of it lend me to recommend people shy away from it. But there are a lot of other good synthetic products. They're either composite materials that are made out of wood impregnated with plastics, or there are some, like these synthetic structural foams, there are some excellent products that are purely plastics that are available. They typically aren't vinyl, but they are maybe polyurethane or, in some cases, polystyrene. So feel free to use synthetic products, but just make sure you know what you're doing when you do it. Before you start to restore your porch, inspect it for signs of previous construction. I use the classic. I had an 1850s era home out in the country. It had a Victorian porch on it. Well, I knew that wasn't the original porch, even though I didn't have pictures of the original porch. But all I had to do was look at the house itself, and you could see leftover from the painting line where the original porch roof was and where the actual columns were. So I could judge from that. I could tell what the width of the original porch was, what the roof line was, and it helped a lot in terms of creating a replacement for that porch. Look at historic photographs. We have a lot of photographs. We may not have one of your house, but if we don't, maybe somebody who lived there previously does. And don't necessarily ask for pictures of the house itself, because not too many people in those old days just took pictures of their houses. I look for the sort of the incidental picture of the house. They might have had some big event, and here was Joe and Mary standing on the front porch, and somebody took a picture of Joe and Mary. That was the focus of their attention. But at the same time, they didn't realize it, but they're recording for history what that porch might have looked like at that time. So just because they may say they don't have a picture of the house. Assuming you're talking to a relative who lived there or somebody who lived there before, but there may be photographs that exist that do give you an example of what that house once was. So take a look at photographs. And then if you don't have any record whatsoever, then look around in your own neighborhood. Again, that's one of our recommendations on the Historic Preservation Commission. If you're going to do something and you don't have any record of what was there, chances are it's not going to be that much different from the other things that are in your neighborhood. See what's styles, see who the craftsmen were in that neighborhood, and then build your creation based on something that's already indigenous to the area. A few porch don'ts. Don't use wrought iron. It was never evident in any of our historic periods that we experienced here in Mount Vernon, other than that 50s revival where they took out the old and put the iron in. Avoid using exposed plywood anywhere. Actually, I can't think of too many instances where you use plywood in a restoration project of a porch, but if you do have to use it, make sure you don't leave it exposed. The one possible exception might be, well, I mean, obviously you use plywood as an underlayment for the roof, and you might be able to successfully use it as a ceiling material, but again, use it with care. 4x4s, I recommended earlier that the proportion of 4x4s typically doesn't work, although it is possible to use a 4x4 as a structural element and then clad that in some wood. Then you can get out to the proportions that probably were appropriate for the given porch. Don't use stair balusters. Again, I'll show you a couple of examples. They just are too tall and spindly for a typical porch. Don't combine elements from different styles. I mean, just as bad as putting a wrong style porch on your house is to use stylistic elements from different eras in the same porch. Precast steps. No, that's a no. All right, what's wrong with this porch? It's not there. Dick made that reference to that earlier, and there's nothing that can change a house more than to take a porch off. Any kind of a porch would have helped here, but this is so typical. Yes, you can tell where the entrance is at. It's right there. Everybody can see. But the first thing you do is don't take the porch off unless you're planning on putting something back. I'd rather see a dilapidated porch than no porch. Don't use substitute wood or wrought iron columns for wood. Again, it just, the wrought iron pretty much ceases to exist visually when you put it in there. In other words, when your eye goes immediately back to the main part of the house, except for this downspout. So the wrought iron just sort of, it's like the roof is hanging there without anything supporting it. This is an unusual one here. This is sort of the Gothic porch revival, where they used some chains that go back to the house. They apparently didn't like the fact that there might have been columns here, which would have made total sense, but instead they put some chains. And now maybe, I didn't stop to knock on the door, maybe they can actually, they've got a crank inside and they can reel that up if there's somebody out there they don't like and it's raining hard. That's not in Mount Vernon. I wouldn't say that if that were in Mount Vernon. This is your classic example of everything not to do with a porch. And I can say that because this one has been restored. But here you've got your cast iron, or your precast steps, you got wrought iron rails, you got wrought iron posts here. There used to be a rail up here that's gone. And another thing they did here, which we don't recommend, is they've changed the level. The porch would have been at the level of the door, and the steps would have been out in front of it. So here you've changed the level of the porch. Instead of being up here, it's down there. So I can't think of too many things additionally that could have been done wrong on this one. Here's another one that's just not appropriate. Again, they didn't like the columns out here. They wanted to be able to drive their car up to within about 8 inches of the house, and the columns were in the way. You can tell where the columns were. They cut them off right there. But this is, when you drive by this house, your eyes just, they focus right on that. It's so foreign to what would have gone on there. When you're enclosing porches, try not to cover up the elements. In other words, there would have been some columns. There would have been a strong line at the floor line. I'll show you some examples of a good way to enclose a porch in a couple of minutes. Here's one where you have just the deck scenario. Here you've got an overhanging roof here, but it doesn't even cover the deck. So even if this had a big porch at one time, a 2-story porch, this wouldn't quite have been it. But here you see this proportion. I don't know where you can get a grasp for that, but these are stair rails, and they're really way too thin and tall for the deck. They should be down about there. So stair rails just don't really work that well for porch. And then here you got the treated wood thing, which sticks out like a sore thumb. Here's sort of a foreign material that wouldn't have been present anywhere. So I like to avoid introducing materials that aren't indigenous to the area or time. And here's a concrete block enclosure.
It's gone, by the way.
Is it?
He ripped that out last week.
Really?
Yeah, that's my neighbor.
Oh, so I
He's ready
should...
to sell the house, so I finally decided to do this for him.
All right. Well, good. I'll have to get an after picture then.
Yeah.
I really like when I can do the befores and afters.
Yes.
Then I don't offend anybody too much. Iowa City example, not a Mount Vernon example. But again, here's a... makes no sense whatsoever. And here's your picture window. This is not in Mount Vernon. Here's a picture window with your fake applied stone. And here's a roof form that wouldn't have been used on this particular kind of house ever, but that's just one of the things wrong, but that certainly is one of them. And now I've got a series of 3 or 4 pictures, we're getting near the end here, showing evolution of a few houses in Mount Vernon. We do have a pretty good inventory of pictures between us and the college, and we're going to try to get the college pictures in our inventory, at least scanned versions of them, and ultimately get them on our website. And ultimately, you'll be able to hopefully search the web and be able to get pictures of a lot of the houses in Mount Vernon without ever leaving your computer. But anyway, here's the evolution of a house in Mount Vernon. This was down, and this will be on our walking tour today, believe it or not. This is the original house. You can see the taller gable here. You can see the chamfered corner here. And this is a 1970s, I wouldn't say improvement, modification to the house where you had the vertical siding and there was still semblance of a porch. Now that porch wasn't there, that's already an addition, the upstairs porch, but that wouldn't have been too bad if some other things had been done. And then you have the house today, which is a ghost of what was once there. Another one of my favorites, a simple little porch, full-length porch, simple little house. It's not one of these Victorian mansions, but today it has a somewhat different appearance. Still has the 5 columns in front. It's just that things have changed a little bit. This is the only antebellum type of mansion we have in Mount Vernon. Anti-something, no. And actually, this one isn't so bad. This is Meeker's house. It's got the Juergens head roof on it, but it had a wraparound porch, which over the ages has been modified to it no longer wraps around. The roof form has been changed, and they've enclosed part of it. But that's not uncommon. You see, people need to capture space, and enclosing a porch is often not a bad way of doing it. And of course, the Morgan Funeral Home is, or the old Morgan Funeral Home, used to have a fairly nice, ornate Victorian porch, and now it has a much simpler version. A couple on enclosing porches, and then some finishing slides. Again, what I like to see when you enclose a porch is express the column and floor lines, and then use a lattice or skirt to enclose the foundation. Here you see the column lines expressed, actually all the way down here you see the floor line expressed. It's not a bad enclosure of a porch. It still looks like a porch because it's got a lot of glass. You wouldn't want to take, for example, and close this in and just put one window in the middle of it. When you enclose a porch, try to keep as much glass in there as you can. Here's another excellent example. This is something you probably wouldn't recommend just because it closes that, and now unless they're doing something to vent that area, you have this potential problem with moisture. But here you've got a porch that was enclosed, but it's still evident that used to be a porch. And we'll finish with 3 of the porch restorations in town. This porch was there, it's just that it needed a lot of work, and they've been working on it for several years, but this is just an excellent example of some of the work that's going on in Mount Vernon. And like Dick, I'd like to get every one that's been restored or built and add it to our list of preservation accomplishments, but collective accomplishments of the community. This is Abby's porch. There never used to be a porch there, but you got some photographs of the original, did you not?
We worked from a little photo that was about 2 by 2.5 inches of the original house, and now we've misplaced that photo. Yeah. But it showed us what the original porch looked like, yeah.
Well, that's an excellent job. And then this one here, which I pointed to earlier, that did everything wrong. Fortunately, it had a nice outcome. This is what it looks like today. They put the balustrade back up here. They raised the level. I mean, this is just a magnificent job of taking something that never did look right and finishing it off.
And you might note that that's one that we didn't have any historic photographs of, as I recall, but they worked with, like Dick Thomas, to figure out what an appropriate style was for that house,
Right.
and then reconstructed it.
So that's my presentation. If you don't have any questions, the last thing we'll do is Jim Engelbrecht, we've moved from macro to medium, and he's going to cover the micro end. I mean, he'll answer a lot of details. I can give you overall ideas, but he can really get into the specifics. Yeah, Dixie?
I had a question about when you come on the porch. A lot of times these Victorian homes had a pretty ornate wood door. What's the correct way to, do you use like a full view storm door in front of that, or no storm door in front of that wood door?
Well, I mean, okay, so you've still got the original door. How do you protect that door?
Right now mine has like an aluminum storm door.
Well, there's two ways
in front.
to go about it. I mean, one would be to purchase, one of these catalogs has new ornate screen doors you can purchase. Of course, that's a screen door. You still would want to make that weather tight, and from that you could probably, what I would do is screw on the inside, have somebody make you a large piece of plexiglass with you can get like one of the storm door manufacturers to make you one with some screw holes in it so you could screw that to the inside, just make it removable. If you wanted something more permanent, I suppose you could go with one of the combination type storms, except one that's as much glass as possible. They've got some that are, only have about 4 inches or 5 inches of metal on 3 sides, and then maybe, yeah. I mean, that's probably a more weather-tight solution and less maintenance type of solution. Now, the only downside to that is, depending on what direction that door faces, when you put that storm door on there, you can, if you're facing south, for example, you can have a tremendous buildup of heat inside that, which can be pretty hard on whatever finish you might happen to have on that door. Other questions?